Greetings, students. I wanted to review Chapter 13 with you from your textbook on the basics of Biblical Hebrew. So it's very helpful if you have this book open to page 139. This is where Chapter 13 begins. We'll be talking about call perfect verbs and strong verbs particularly. It's very important that you master this chapter, and before you move on to the next chapter, it is very solid in your mind. So please do the exercises, follow through all the paradigms, make sure you memorize those endings, and when you feel confident, only then move on to the weak verbs chapter, which is the next one. It will be very hard to understand chapter 14 if you do not have a good handle on chapter 13. So let's get into the very core of the chapter and see what it's all about. So this is all about strong verbs. Please keep that in mind. That's not the entire verbal system. It's just the beginning. Remember, they're strong and they're weak verbs as well in Hebrew. Why is this chapter so critical and so important? Because the call stem, as we have discussed in chapter 12 about the stems in the various 7 different stems that are in Hebrew, the call stem constitutes about 69% of all the verbs in the Hebrew Bible. So that is a huge percent of the share of the verbs. That means most of the time you're going to encounter a verb in the Hebrew Bible, it's going to be call. Not every time, but quite often it will be call. So it's very important for you to understand this because this is the foundation. To begin, let me say that call stem verbs are active in voice and simple or unnuanced in their action. So obviously remember we talked about active and passive and reflexive voices. Call is always active. And the simple action versus a very complicated action, we talked about the continuous action and different aspects of action going on. So call is active and simple, meaning unnuanced. And the simple action of the call stem is further divided into 3 different groups, three groups of how this call stem can function, or 3 functions we can call them. But basically, there's transitive and intransitive and stative. Now, transitive verbs can take a direct object. That's basically why we call them transitive. In this type of a verb, the example is the prophet wrote the book. So where we basically have the book as being a direct object. And unfortunately, not all verbs can take a direct object. There are just certain verbs that have a particular meaning, and their meaning itself prohibits them from being able to take an object, a direct object. There could be an indirect object associated with it, but not a direct object. So those verbs we call intransitive. Intransitive verbs basically are, there's an example here for you that the author of the book gives us, and it's the king perished in battle. So the verb is perished, and it cannot take a direct object. It's just stating a fact. The king perished in battle. There's no action that is being referred to a direct object of some sort. So that's intransitive verbs. Transitive can take a direct object, intransitive cannot take a direct object. And then there's stative. What are stative verbs? Stative verbs describe a state of being. And the example is the priest is old. And the verbal construction here is old, and it describes basically a condition of the subject. The priest is old. That's it. It's a state of being. And so there's an idea that is being expressed here, the idea of the verb to be, and that is a stative verb. So when something is being described almost in adjective-like fashion, that's your stative verb. The examples that the author gives us in the textbook is kaved is to be heavy. When something is heavy, something is just simply heavy. It's describing its quality. Or katon, to be small. That's another good description. Something is small, and that's all it is that we can say about it. So in a sense, it is a verb, but it also is a verb that describes a state of being, a condition of some sort. And that's the idea of stative verbs. So that's the three, sort of say, categories that we're looking at here in call. Now, let's talk a little bit about the perfect conjugation. We talked in chapter 12 how there's different conjugations that are out there, and we talked about them not really being times or tenses as we are used to think of them in English, but really speaking about the aspect or a kind of an action. Well, perfect conjugation, which is what we're studying in this chapter, is used to express a completed action or a state of being, if it's a stative verb, completed action or a state of being, whether that action occurred in the past, in the present, or in the future. I know this is confusing because people think about tenses as having to do with temporal reference to present, past, and future, but that's not what we're meaning when we're saying conjugation. Conjugation is a type of an action, not when it happened. So obviously, part of that description is, could be temporal, but that's not the core. So the perfect conjugation is sometimes called the suffix. We call them the suffixes. We call them endings. They could be different inflectional endings or what the textbook calls as suffixatives. And they're added to the verbal stem in order to indicate the person, gender, and number. So remember, verbs have stems, and then those endings being added on to the stem are the conjugations. So in Hebrew, perfect verbs are most often translated by English past tense. That's what we usually, that's the best translation that we can find in English. For example, I wrote, or the present perfect tense, I have written. So that's perfect verbs in Hebrew and the way we try to render them in English. And here is the call perfect strong verb paradigm. And this is the paradigm that I really want you to know. It's found on page 141 in your textbooks, and I simply need you to memorize it. You need to know it in every way. I need you to know the endings themselves. It's important to know the endings. I need you to know the paradigm, the forms of the verbs as the way the verb actually moves through the different persons and numbers. And the translations. The translations are important too. What's important is you know the stem, you see the changes that are happening in the stem as the paradigm moves through the different persons. But also it's important for you to notice the change, the endings. So keep in mind, pay attention to the if any changes occur in the stem, which is colored in black, and then pay attention to the endings themselves. Endings are good to know by themselves. And it's also very important that you remember this order, the order of persons and numbers. It begins with a third person masculine singular, he. Why does the paradigm begin with the first person masculine singular? It's very simple because he is, or the third person masculine singular is the dictionary form. This is what you will find in a dictionary when you look up a verb, katal. Katal means to kill, so katal actually means he killed. Third person masculine singular. And that's what we're looking at. We have a verb katal here. We could put another verb in it. I'll show you that in the next slide. And the endings will be the same. So when we look at the third person masculine singular, it is simply katal. We have the root, kof, tet, lamed, and underneath the root is the kamatz and the patach. So it begins with the kamatz, and the second vowel is the patach. Now you move to the next one, the third person third person feminine singular. I'm sorry, and the inflection changes, and it says katla. Katla, she killed. So katal, he killed. Katla, she killed. What just happened? You have the kamatse ending that added on. You could see it marked in red right here, and that's the ending that is being basically, pointed out for you here. And you also have the stem, and I want you to pay attention to the stem. The stem has a little meteg under the first consonant. You can see next to the vowel right here, next to the kamats, there's a little meteg. Meteg is this little vertical mark that is right next to your vowel. And what it's doing is telling you right here that this is not to be pronounced as an O, but it is actually to be pronounced as an A. So this is not a kamatz chatuf. And notice that the second consonant in the third feminine singular that we're looking at, the second consonant underneath it, the vowel has changed. It's not a patak anymore. It's now a shva. So please notice that this change occurs in third person feminine singular, and this change also occurs in the third person common plural right here. The second stem vowel changes. In all the other ones, as you could see, as you look through the stem, through that whole paradigm, the vowels remain the same. This is the only changes. So if you memorize them, that this is a third person common plural and a third person feminine singular, where the second stem vowel changes to a shva, this will actually help you memorize your call perfect, and it will also help you to recognize them when you see them in the text. So we have katal, he killed, katla, she killed. You killed, when the second masculine singular comes out, so we have katalta, katalta. If you notice that, if you remember your pronominal endings and if you remember your proper pronouns, that maybe this will be easier for you to memorize this chart as well, because if you know how to say you, masculine singular in Hebrew, which is ata, ata rhymes with katalta, ata, katalta. You can see how that pronoun actually is telling you what the ending is going to be in this call perfect second masculine singular paradigm. And the same happens with other places. Like, for example, if we look at the last one, the first person common plural, we, it says katal nu. The ending is nu, and the stem is still katal, is same as it has been throughout the whole paradigm. But if you know how to say we in Hebrew, which is anachnu, so anachnu katalnu, ata katalta. If you see the similarity here, that this will help you remember that. Also look at first person. It says katalti. Well, how do you say I am? How do you say first person in Hebrew? Well, that's ani. Ani katalti. Notice that those endings are actually reflecting the pronominal endings that you have already studied. And so if you know your pronouns, memorizing the call perfect strong verb paradigm may be a little bit easier. So I need you to memorize the endings. I need you to memorize these forms. I need you to memorize the stem vowels, where they change, and the endings themselves, and put it together. And please be ready to produce this on the quiz. If you move on to the next part of your chapter, you could see that there's more of the same paradigm here. Basically, you have several other verbs here, like this is on page 142 in your textbook. So you have the verb kabatz, means together, and shamar, and katav, and zahar, and yashav. Shamar means to keep, to observe, katav means to write, zahar means to remember, and yashav to dwell. So what you're seeing here is that same exact paradigm in works, and the difference is that we just putting different verbs in and plugging them into this paradigm, and you could see that they are working the same way. Predictably, their endings are the same, their vowels are the same, they change the same way, and if you notice, the second stem vowel still turns into schwa in the third person feminine singular, and um, and the same happens in the third person common plural. So the changes are uniform. What I'm trying to show you in this chart, and what the authors are trying to show you, is that once you memorize the call perfect strong verbs paradigm, let's say you memorize it with, I don't want you to memorize it with a verb katal, to kill, then keep in mind that plugging in another verb, knowing what that verb is, like kabatz, is not going to change. As long as it's a strong verb in call, it's going to be very, very predictable. It's going to follow that pattern, and all the endings going to be the same. And that's what we're trying to show to you on this multi-word paradigm, that there's a great consistency with strong verbs. So let's move on. The verbal roots ending with in tav. This is a little bit different. Just remember, strong verb is a strong verb. But what happens when you have a verb that ends in a tav, and then there are some endings in the paradigm that begin with a tav? So what you have is a verbal root, a verbal stem. The root itself has a tav, and then the ending has a tav. The two tavs bump up against each other. And so when that happens, they fuse into one, and they become, and then it gets a dagesh forte. The tav gets a dagesh forte. So you have the verb karat. Karat means to cut. So karata. You have the karat, which is this is the tav, the third letter, just happens to be part of the root, and then you have the ending, the ta ending, and so you have two tavs in a row. That's kind of hard. So what does Hebrew do? Hebrew simply assimilates the second tav into the first one, and instead of two tavs in a row, you have tav with a dagesh forte inside it to indicate that there used to be a second tav there. So maybe for a while you've been wondering about dagesh forte and what's its purpose, because it doesn't, seem to be serving any kind of a purpose. Well, we needed to move a little bit further into the grammar for you to understand its purpose. But this is where it becomes clear why that dagesh forte is important, because as you work backwards from what that word used to be, you can now figure it out. So the same situation will work if you have a first person common singular, I. You have the verb karat still, and it says karati. So you have two tavs bumping against each other, and they turn into a single, and it just becomes karate with the dagesh forte and the tav. So there's a bit of assimilation that happens here that you need to know. And the only reason it happens is because the root happens to end with the same letter that the ending begins with. So there's that bumping action, and the fusion occurs. Same situation happens with the roots ending with in noon. You have some verbs, like this particular one is shahan. Shahan means to dwell. And then in some endings in our paradigm, we have endings that begin with the noon, like the nu ending in the first person common plural, we. So we have the word shahan, shahan nu. So you have two noons in a row. What happens? They combine, become one, and it simply is shahanu. and there is a dagesh forte once again inside that noon. And that's your indication. So there's a little bit of a strangeness going on here, but only when those verbs end in the same kind of letter that the ending begins with. And that's a natural, sort of say, assimilation that occurs. Now, there's a little bit of a confusion sometimes with stative verbs. Stative verbs are usually classified by their stem vowel. The stem vowel is what we mean is the stem vowel is the vowel that is associated with a second root consonant. When we say stem vowel, that's what we mean. Second root consonant. What's underneath that second root consonant is the stem vowel. So with strong verbs that are transitive, the stem vowel patach, and that's very, consistent. With stative verbs, the stem vowel is variable. And there are three classes of stative verbs. The patach stative, where that still remains as we expect it to be, like in the verb gadal, to be great. And then they have some verbs that are sere stative, where you have sere appearing. So instead of the patach, now you have the sere, as in kaved, to be heavy. And then there is a third one, a third stem vowel, and that's a holum. So as in katon, to be small. Please keep in mind that this variation happens only in the stative verbs. So remember, there is transitive and stative in call, but out of those, only within statives you would have a stem vowel variation. So it's really not, a huge, sort of say, occurrence, but you need to know about it in case you see it. You need to be aware of it. Certainly not a major point in this chapter, but it's good to know because it will come in handy as we continue to study. Now, here's the stative verb paradigm, call perfect. The same thing. Once again, the three groups, the patach, the tsere, and the holum categories, and see how they change going through the call perfect paradigm. So this is a good one for you to notice. A few of them have been highlighted for you in red. You could see where the strangeness and the changes occur to accommodate this unusual, sort of say, situation. But that's not something I really want you to focus on at this point, because what's most important for me is that you understand the call perfect paradigm on the regular strong verbs, not really on the exceptions. This is more along the line of the occasionally occurring situation rather than the normal rule. So another part about stative verbs that needs to be mentioned, once again, not a major point, but it needs to be mentioned, is that stative verbs are closely related and correspond to adjectives. Now, for example, you have the verb zaken here, and it could either be a call perfect third masculine singular stative verb, meaning he is old, or it can be a masculine singular adjective that just means old. So when you look at the word like that, you say, what is it? I don't know. So look at kaved. Kaved means it could be a stative verb called perfect third masculine singular, something that is being heavy. Or you could have that as a masculine singular adjective, and is spelled in the same exact way, kaved. So is it a verb and call perfect, or is it an adjective? And the difference between the two is one is inflected as a verb and the other one as an adjective. It just happens to be that they overlap. The only way you can figure this out is by actually looking at context and see what those other words are related to in the sentence, and that's how you can master that. Once again, I'm just bringing this out to your attention. This is something unusual and peculiar about stative verbs that you need to know. And as we move along, let's talk briefly about the parsing. When we talk about parsing the verbs, we're talking about parsing the verbal stem, the conjugation, the person, the gender, and the number, and the verbal root. So, for example, I have the verb zahar, and here I have zaharti. Zaharti means this is a first person. I forgot. Basically, I forgot. And it's call perfect. Uh, that's what you have to tell me about it. First person, common singular, and the verbal root is zahar. So that's what we're looking at when we're asking for parsing on verbs. We need to talk a little bit about the negative particle le. This negative particle basically comes in front of verbs, and because perfect verbs can be negated, le means no or not. Usually it's translated not when it's attached to a verb, and there's two ways of spelling it. You can spell it with just a lamed holem ayin, or there's a holem vav that can be involved there. So either way, it means the same. There's just two ways of spelling it. But look, for example, at this sentence. We talked about Hebrew being a verbal language and words flowing with the verbs in front. Well, here you have a negation in front of the verb. Look at this sentence. It says, Lo shmartem et hatorot. And it translates as not you kept or observed. The at is a definite direct object marker. Hatorot, the laws. We say in English, you did not observe the laws. Well, this is you, by the way, plural. You could see that ending tem. It tells you that this is you, plural. Lo shmartem. Not observed the law. Not observed you. You is coded in right here in this ending. The laws. It's very backwards, in a sense. English doesn't flow that way. Hebrew does. Let's see. Look at the next sentence. Lo zacharta et habirit. You did not remember the covenant. Once again, in Hebrew, it says not you remembered. You. This is masculine singular. You. Et habirit. The covenant. The covenant. But still, not you remembered the covenant. That's very different from the way English works. But this little particle will appear in front of verbs and basically will flip the meaning of the verb. So if the verb means remember, it will say remember not. Did not remember. So this is the opposite. So I just want you to be aware of that, because as you get into reading those verbs in actual sentences, you will encounter the negation. So that's pretty much the overview of the main content of this chapter. So I'm going to take a moment to review the vocabulary with you as well. Vocabulary is important. It's good for you to know it, because you will be quizzed on it anyway. So I'm going to take your textbook and just run through the words that are your vocabulary words for chapter 13. They're found on page 148. Let's look together. The first one is barach. Barach means to bless. Next verb is zahar. Zahar means to remember, to recall, to call to mind, or to mention. Zaken is another verb. Well, you can see it here. It says to be or to become old. This is your, once again, this is your stative verb. It's very clear to see that, the second stem vowel has changed. It's no longer patah. Hazak. Hazak is to be or to become strong, to grow firm, to have courage. Yada is to know, to have understanding. It can mean to know someone sexually in a biblical knowledge, I guess, biblical knowing. Then also the word kaved, to be heavy, to be honored. It can mean to be honored. Katav means to write upon, or to register, or to record. Maleh means to be full or to fill. Malach, to be or to become a king or a queen, or to reign or to rule. It's a basic understanding of reigning. Matza, to find, to reach, to obtain. Pakad, to attend, to pay attention, to take care of, to number, to appoint, to visit. It has a number of, the range of meanings is a little bit broader than that word. Okay. Shachav, to lie down, to have sexual intercourse with someone. Shalach, to send, or it can mean also to stretch out. And shamar is to watch, or to watch over, or to guard, or to keep, or to observe, or to protect. So once again, depending on the context, could be very broad meanings here. So that's our vocabulary. Please study the vocabulary carefully. You could take these strong verbs, you can practice your paradigm with them and see what happens. Obviously, keep in mind that there are some verbs here that are stative. That means that they will work through the paradigm a little bit differently. But please study the vocabulary because it will certainly be on the quiz, and most of your translation exercises, even in the quiz, are going to be made up with these words, with these new verbs that you have to study.